All right, Dan, you had something to say? If you don't mind just referencing which verse you're referring to, so we can all. We looked at verse 19. Verse 21. What about verse? What about verse? Where are we over here? 31, 27, 28. What clues can you pick up from these verses about when do you think Purim should be?
Annually observed annually on the 14th day of the month.
So in verse 16 and 17 of chapter 9, right, it basically tells us that in the entire kingdom of Achashverosh, they celebrated on the 14th of Adar in the actual year of the story of Purim. And in Shushan, which is the capital where it was all taking place, they celebrated on the battle took an extra day, and they celebrated on the 15th. So that's the history. That's what happened. Then in verse 19, where it says, what tells us, therefore, what are we going to do in the future? It says, therefore, the Jews who are present, who are in the unwalled cities, celebrate on the 14th of Adar. It doesn't say anything about what the people in the walled cities do. It just says that the unwalled cities do on the 14th. And then if you look later on, throughout the chapter, there's numerous references to the days, right? So in verse 21, it says they accepted upon, and then in verse 21, you have the reference to the 14th and the 15th, that we should celebrate Purim on the 14th and the 15th if you were just to read verse 21, it would sound like everybody that celebrates the 14th and the 15th, right? It doesn't differentiate between which cities, And then if you look later on, a number of times throughout the chapter, it talks about the days, just as these days in verse 26, verse 27, verse 28. And then if you look at verse 31, again, the days, their times in the plural. Now, the only differentiation we seem to have is in the year of the Megillah, of the story, we have the differentiation between Shushan and other cities. And in the following years, we have explicitly mentioned unwalled cities, and perhaps the implication is that walled cities are different. But it doesn't say that explicitly, and there doesn't seem to be any obvious reason. If you differentiate between Shushan and everywhere else, that would resonate. But why are we differentiating between unwalled cities and walled cities? So, as you can imagine, there's many different approaches to this question. Halacha, let's just start from the end. The halacha, based on the Gemara, is based on the Mishnah, actually. The Mishnah says that the halacha is like this, that any city which was walled, which had a wall around it in the time of Yehoshua bin Nun, in the time when the Jewish people came, led by Yehoshua, into conquering the land, any city that had a wall then celebrates Purim on the 15th, like Shushan. Any city that did not have a wall then celebrates Purim on the 14th. It doesn't make a big difference whether it has a wall now or doesn't have a wall now. It could be a city that does have a wall now, but if it didn't have a wall in the time of Yeshua, we do it on the 14th. It could be a wall that does not have a wall now, but if it didn't have a wall in the time of Yeshua, then we do it on the 15th. What about Shushan itself? Even though Shushan did not have a wall in the time of Yehoshua bin Nun, so it was come out with the absurdity that Shushan itself is doing Purim on the 14th. So for this, the Gemara says, no, Shushan is different, because even though it didn't have a wall in the time of Yehoshua, nevertheless, they celebrate Purim on the 15th because that's where it all happened, on the 15th. Now, why so that's the halacha. Why are we making this difference? Why are we differentiating between walled cities and non-walled cities. Why is that? Why is that a thing, right? Um, so there could be a number of different approaches to this. Very interestingly, the Ramban posits that this is in the beginning of his commentary to the tractate Megillah, the Gemara, and he basically says that the people in the walled cities were less threatened by the decree because they were going to be able to defend themselves much better, and so therefore originally they weren't even really so much part of celebrating Purim because they were never really under the threat. And it was only later on when, as we read at the end of chapter 9, that Mordechai and Esther sent out letters to the entire Jewish people asking them to celebrate Purim, where they started celebrating Purim. And again, I'm not going to get into exactly now why that they should therefore be on the 15th, but that's already a clue as to why there should be a difference between walled cities and unwalled cities. Interesting to note that this is kind of opening a whole new can of worms, which I don't think we'll have time to get into now. Maybe we'll do it, maybe this will be a good topic for next year or something. What about Jewish communities, both locations and communities, who lived in places that were not affected by the decree of Achashverosh, right? Achashverosh ruled over 127 Medina states, whatever that is. Now, the Gemara says that that was the whole world. Now, within the Gemara itself, there are those commentaries who understand that to mean literally, and there are those who understand it various different ways of interpreting the Gemara to not be literally that Achashverosh ruled the whole world. But even if you do understand the Gemara to mean that Achashverosh was Moshel B'Kippur, he ruled the whole world, certainly there are numerous other sources, even in Chazal and in Rishonim, that Achashverosh did not rule the whole world. Many say that he had, what's the word in English, when you have a big king or emperor he appoints sort of puppet governments in other countries who are at some level subservient to him. There's a word in
Russia.
Is it vassal state? Is that a word?
That would be one word. A vassal state is a state that's controlled by the outside authority.
Right.
So subservient to it.
Right. Okay. So that's one way of understanding it. Whatever the case is, there seems to be very much basis, and certainly from a historical perspective, it would seem to be the case that Achashverosh didn't actually rule the whole world, and that there were many Jews who lived in places that were not threatened by his decree. Some Mepharshim say that that's actually what Haman tried to trick Achashverosh into telling him that they were all in his land. And I saw somebody actually bringing that we don't have time to go into all the whole. If you go through chapter 9 carefully, he says that you say that if originally it says that he sent Mordechai sent the letter to all the Jews who were in the Medinas of Melech Achashverosh, in the lands that were under Achashverosh's rule, and only later does it say that he sent it to 127 countries, and there it adds the words that Haman wanted to annihilate all the Jews. The first time, there's emphasis that Sof Kol Sof, the Purim is relevant to everybody. Anyway, again, just wanted to bring that up because it's a fascinating topic and question, the Ethiopian Jews. There's a tradition from Reb Don, what's his name, from the Eldad Hadoni, that the 10 tribes, he had a letter that the 10 tribes didn't keep Purim. Whatever the case is, this touches upon this because the Ramban is saying that that there were cities that didn't.
They weren't threatened.
Right, Dan. If I could just ask you to remind me after the class, we got to fix that wire with the internet thing because I keep on getting the internet's not stable, so we need to somehow take off that piece at the end and replace it. That the clicker got broken.
Do you have the equipment?
No, that's what we need to buy. But if we could just advise me.
Wire crimper.
Hmm?
Wire crimper.
All right.
So you need a crimper.
So again, let's just sort of reorient ourselves. Which right, the Megillah implicitly makes a difference between walled cities and unwalled cities, and the question is why. The Ran in Megillah says that he says that actually, basically, he said we have to make a differentiation. We wanted everybody to remember the 15th. I mean, even though most people are keeping Purim on the 14th, because that's when most people actually celebrated. But really, the 15th is really important because that's where everything happened in Shushan. That was the real, I mean, if you look at the numbers over here, right? The amounts of people that were killed in Shushan compared to the amount of people that were killed. Outside of Shushan, there was 75,000. And how many were in Shushan? First day was 500. Then it was 300. Okay, so it's not so representative in the numbers, but Shushan is the capital. That's where it's all happening. And so mainly we have to make some way of remembering the 15th. So we could have just said, let's do only Shushan should do on the 15th. But if it's only going to be Shushan, then most Jews are not going to really know about that because how many Jews are there in Shushan? In fact, nowadays, there isn't exact agreement amongst historians exactly where the ancient Shushan was. And certainly, I mean, there is a Jewish community in Iran, and they even have a tomb which is supposedly the tomb, the resting place of Mordechai and Esther, although that's questionable. Historians are not. Again, I'm not expert on the thing, but it's certainly not. It's far from. It's certainly ambiguous whether actually that is the burial place of Mordechai and Esther. Be that as it may, there may be Jews over there who do Purim 2 days misafik as a doubt, but there isn't any Jews who own in Shushan, who in Iran, in Persia, anywhere there, who do Purim only on the 15th. So imagine if the only place would have been Shushan who does it, it would have been forgotten. So in order to make sure that the miracle of the 15th doesn't go forgotten, we decided to make this, to take some quality that Shushan has, namely being a walled city, and apply it to all walled cities, and specifically to choose the benchmark as being Yeshua ben Nun, because that honors Eretz Yisrael. If you're going to say any city that was walled in the time of the miracle of Achashverosh, so then Eretz Yisrael, which was for the most part not doing so well at the time, which, by the way, is another interesting question. If there's another whole topic about how many Jews were actually living in Israel at the time of the miracle of Purim. Some even tried to make the argument that most Jews were already back in Israel with Ezra, or many Jews. But anyway, but basically, But by diverting it to the time of Yeshua ben Nun, so then we are honoring and remembering the miracles in Eretz Yisrael. There is, I should mention, there is an opinion in the Tosefta that says that the determining factor is which city was walled in the time of Achashverosh, right. But Lamaisa, the Mishnah paskins, and that's how we paskin, that it depends on Yeshua ben Nun. And then the question, like I mentioned before, the question is, okay, well, what about Shushan itself, which wasn't walled in the time of Yeshua ben Nun? And we say, no, Shushan is different. The Gemara brings this. Amarava, no, Shani Shushan Shanasa Beines. Okay. Now, how do we know? I left my phone with my Rambam. Anybody have a Rambam on their phone? Hilchas Megillah, if you don't mind to open to Hilchas Megillah, Parak Aleph. It's the end of Sefer Zmanim. So, how do we know? Where does it say this here? Where does it say that there's a difference that that's walled cities from the time of Yehoshua? So in the Bavli, in the Gemara in the Bavli, it says that we have a Gzeira Shava. Does anybody remember which law in the Torah, one of the 613 mitzvahs, more than one, two of the 613 mitzvahs, that, but one of them is explicit in the Torah, that apply to walled cities? That there's a difference between a walled city and an open city.
Well, it's dealing with land management, isn't it?
Very good.
Which you could tell us in Delaware?
Perek Aleph.
Eric Aleph?
Thank you. Anybody remember more details than that? Right. So there's the Bayis Asher Lo Yichoy, but there's all the rules, or the laws in Parashas. I think it's Mechukesai, right? Bahar Mechukesai, the end of Sefer Vayikra, that when you sell property, when you sell fields, when you sell houses, etc., there's all these. There's the regulations of till when we allow you to buy it back before it's nechlat biyad hakoina, that it's sort of transferred to his ownership. Obviously, he could always choose to, but so one of the differences is that a house in a walled city, you basically have 12 months to the day to redeem it, and if you miss the 12 months mark, then that's it. It completely belongs to the buyer, right? So in that context, the Torah uses the word prozi. Prozi is like the same word that we have here, prozis, which means unwalled cities, open cities, right? So the Gemara says that we have a Gzeira Shava. Gzeira Shava, we know Gzeira Shava, we say it every morning in davening, Shleishas Middas, right? Gzeira Shava basically means that when you have a common word used in two different contexts, so then we have a Kabbalah from Moshe Rabbeinu, which words exactly it applies to, that you could derive something and apply it from A to B based on the common word. So because in that context we have the word prazi, and in that context when the Torah talks about the laws of selling a house in a walled city, it refers specifically to a city that was walled from the time of Yeshua ben Nun. So too in the Megillah, when he uses that same word prazi, and we're implying that there's a difference between the date of Purim for walled cities or open cities, we're going to use the benchmark of Yeshua ben Nun. That's what the Gemara says. That's our Gemara, what we call our Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud, the Gemara, Talmud Bavli. The Yerushalmi says something completely different, which I alluded to before, and that is Lachli Kavod Be'eretz Yisrael. That's in order to give honor to Eretz Yisrael. And in the words of the Rambam, and it's interesting that usually we pass like the Bavli. Usually, if there's something different between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, we go with the Bavli. And here, the Rambam and many of the Rishonim don't even mention the Bavli, and they only mention the Yerushalmi. And you'll see soon that this has some really strong practical ramification. But let's just see the Rambam. The Rambam is in chapter 1 of the Laws of Megillah, Halacha Hey. And I'll read it to you just straight out of the English here. This is probably from Sefaria, okay. Although the castle city of Shushan was not surrounded by a wall in the days of Yeshua ben Nun, the Megillah, hold on. Yeah. So first in Halacha Daled he introduces the fact that walled cities do it on the 15th, open cities do it on the 14th, and then he continues. Although the castle city of Shushan was not surrounded by a wall in the days of Yeshua ben Nun, the Megillah is read. I could scroll in, but then hold on. Sorry. Right, the Megillah is read there on the 15th of Adar because it was there that the miracle occurred, as it is written the rest on the 15th. This was made to depend on the days of Yehoshua and in deference to Eretz Yisrael, which was in ruins at that time. The inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael were to be considered residents of walled cities so as to read the Megillah at the same time as the residents of Shushan. Although Eretz Yisrael is still desolate, its residents are to read the Megillah on the 15th of Adar in localities that used to be surrounded in deference by defense walls during the period of Yeshua. Eretz Yisrael is just remembered in connection with the miracle of Purim. So the Rambam basically paraphrases the Yerushalmi as this is our excuse to give more prominence and sensuality to Eretz Yisrael. Now, just to go back to the Bavli a second, there's two sort of strange things going on over here. Firstly, we mentioned here the Gzeira Shava. I was hoping somebody might ask this. Gzeira Shava mentioned works that we have a tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu that tells us word A and word B, the same word in two different locations, you could serves as a bridge. How does that help us from Megillas Esther? And we don't seem to find anywhere in Gemara, we don't usually find the Gzeir Shava from somewhere in the Torah, in the 5 books, to somewhere in Nach. Seems to be a strange thing. And just to sort of further emphasize this, making this Gzeir Shava prazi, even if I'm to take it at face value, also seems strange because who instituted Purim? It's very explicit in the Megillah. It was Mordechai and Esther. So at the very most, what prazi can teach us is what Mordechai and Esther instituted. They instituted to differentiate between walled cities in the time of Yeshua ben Nun or not. Why would they choose to do that? Right? Again, the Yerushalmi has this thing of Eretz Yisrael. But if you're just to take the Bavli at face value, right? What's going on? Why are we making it? Okay, so we have prazi, fine. So, but why? You still have the Gemara says, why are we making a difference? And the Gemara answers prazi. Well, that doesn't really answer the question. It just says how we know we make a difference, or how we know what the difference is. But it doesn't tell us why we made that difference. Now, the Rasag, Reb Sadi Goin, he writes, let me try and quote him. Sadi Goin writes, in the city of Reb Sadi Goin, he writes that any city that was walled and had a wall around it from the time of Yeshua ben Nun in Eretz Yisrael does Purim on the 15th. So he sort of did a quick sleight of hand over there, and he sneaked in these extra 2 words in Eretz Yisrael. So, and again, that seems to be in line with the Yerushalmi that the reason is that we want to give deference to Eretz Yisrael. So he says, okay, walled city is Eretz Yisrael. You have a walled city in Chutz La'aretz, but why should they do it? So Shushan, of course, because like the Gemara is. Okay. But Lamaisa.
Do we know some walled cities outside?
Oh, very good. That's exactly where I was going to next. Now, Lamaisa, there are dozens of cities outside of Eretz Yisrael where there used to be a practice to do 2 days of Purim. Now, okay, I should mention that even though usually we say Safek D'Rabbanan L'Hakel, that when you have a Din D'Rabbanan, if you have a doubt, you go, you're lenient. Lamaisa, and it's beyond the scope right now to get into all the details of why. Lamaisa, when it comes to the Megillah, the Rishonim Paskin based in the Gemaras, Safek L'Chumra, that if you have a city where it's questionable as to whether or not it was walled at the times of Yeshua, you do both days of Purim. You have to do all the mitzvahs twice. And with the exception that the first day on the 14th, which is the day that most of the world keep Purim, you say a bracha. And on the second day, you do all the mitzvahs again, but without a bracha. Now, in many cities in Chutz La'aretz, the minhag was to do 2 days of Purim, to read the Megillah twice. Before I give you the list of cities, you may remember last year we did a class on reading the Megillah in English. And that was a very popular class. It has close to 1,000 views on YouTube. And over there, a lot of the source material was based on the Rishonim discussing reading the Megillah in some ancient version of Spanish. And we had then the Shutra Hanach, who he had this observation. He said, well, he thinks that there was a city that was a suffix, whether they had to do it on the 15th. So they used to do it they used to read the Megillah twice. But when the 15th fell on Shabbos, in which case, anyway, you like last year, anyway, you read the Megillah on the 14th, right? But just to remember, the 15th is reading the day, they used to read a Spanish version of the Purim story on the 15th. And that then developed into people reading the Megillah in Spanish. It's clear that that there was a time when many places in Europe used to read the Megillah in Spanish, only in Spanish. So he's we discussed last year this at length. Anyway, so already there you see the Ranach reporting to us that there were places which were doing in Europe that were doing the Megillah on both days. Now, there are a host of cities outside of Eretz Yisrael where we find historically, if you go through the material, there's reference to them doing 2 days. I'll tell you the list of cities. Okay, you have Izmir, which is in Turkey. You have Kushta, which is today Constantinople. Today it's Istanbul, right? Baghdad, that's in Iraq. Damascus, it's in Syria. Prague used to do 2 days. Sur, how do you say that in English? Is that in Lebanon? Is that Tyre? Is that what you say? Yeah. There's a city in Italy. There's, I think, even some cities in Yemen used to do 2 days. And what? And there was even, I forget the name of it offhand, but I should have written this down. There was even a city in Poland, I think actually in Galicia, where they used to do Purim, 2 days of Purim. They used to begin again on the 15th. So, first of all, okay, so this is obviously doesn't work with the Rasag, right? It's obviously, and like I mentioned, the Rambam, everyone paskins that walled cities all over the world. Even though the reason to differentiate between walled cities is we may accept the reason of the Yerushalmi, but the bottom line is that we then, by extension, apply that to any city that was walled in the time of Yehoshua ben Nun. Now, the problem is that with the exception of a few, possibly, Baghdad and some of those, most of those cities, Prague and Istanbul and many others, there isn't even a shadow of a doubt that those cities did not exist and were not walled in the time of Yehoshua ben Nun. So why were all these cities, and like we mentioned the Ranach, it seems to have been a very, very common practice for many people, many cities, to celebrate the 15th as well. And sort of over the years, it dwindled, possibly by the encouragement of the Rabbonim, who tried to discourage it for various reasons. But what were all these people thinking? Why were they doing Purim on the 15th? Now you could say, okay, so some have said that they were just ignorant of history, and that basically, because the halacha is, so the halacha is that if it's actually brought this in Shulchan Aruch, that if you have a city which currently has a wall around it, and you don't know how old the wall is, so then you have to go l'chumra. If it's an old wall, you have to go l'chumra and assume that it might have been there from Yehoshua ben Nun. So some have said, look, that these people, the ancient communities in Istanbul and in Prague, they didn't really know history, and they saw an old wall, right? Nowadays, we know for certain that those cities were not around in the times of Yehoshua ben Nun. But in those days, they knew it was old. They didn't know the difference between 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. So, they did it. That's a very difficult argument to make. It's very difficult to argue that they were so ignorant of history.
Wasn't London considered a walled city?
Well, it depends. I mean, another part of the question becomes, well, what's considered a wall? I believe that the city in Poland that did it didn't actually have a wall around it, but had a big fortress in it. So part of it was walled. So if the fortress was walled, then the rest of the city, that's another thing. That when it comes to Purim, it's not just the walled city itself that does Purim on the 15th, but there's anything that's samuch v'nireh, anything that's in close proximity to the walled city, which we'll get to soon, right? I mean, you could even make the argument Chicago, until a few years ago, there used to be a wall down Howard Street, but I don't know that counts as a wall.
What about an island?
Oh, so that's another question. On an island, because the Gemara question, that's one of the reasons for Tveria. Tveria is surrounded by water. So the question is it a defense wall? So the Tveria doesn't need a defense wall because it has the defense water. Okay, so that's also, that's also a question. So what were all these people thinking? What were all these people thinking of doing Purim on the 15th? Now, it could be that they never really thought. Yeah, well, it could be that it was just, like we saw the Ranach, they read the Megillah in Spanish. It was, like we mentioned before from the Ran, that we do have this idea that we would like to make sure people don't forget about the importance of celebrating the 15th. So they, without a bracha, what's wrong? Read the Megillah again. You read it in Spanish, you read it in Hebrew, whatever, you celebrate again. However, it has been suggested that actually, going back to the question we posed a few minutes ago, the Gemara asks, why are we differentiating between walled cities and open cities? And the Gemara answers, Gzeira Shava Prazi. And like we mentioned, like doesn't seem to be a real Gzeira Shava because it's between the Torah and Nach, and there doesn't seem to be any reason for it. So based on that whole question, so one approach to that question, so as we saw, most Rishonim say that actually we still have to adopt what the Yerushalmi says, that we have this agenda to promote Eretz Yisrael. But other Rishonim seem to imply that because of this Gzeira Shava, what we're saying is that we're using precedents. In other words, Mordechai and Esther wanted to make a difference between a walled city and a not walled city. Whether you take the reason of the Ramban because the walled cities were less threatened, or whether you want to take the reason of the Ran that we wanted to make sure people don't forget about the 15th. So we're going to make some difference. But how are we going to make the criteria? So the criteria is going to be anything that was something that we have precedence for. So when it comes to the laws of selling a house in a walled city, that's where we have prime precedence, and over there Yeshua ben Nun is the landmark, right? So therefore we take that same in halacha. There's a concept called the Raisa Takon that whenever Chazal institute something, they look for precedence in the Torah for it. So we applied that to Purim as well. Now then you could extrapolate. Well, when we say something a walled city from the time of Yeshua ben Nun, is there any way of creating a walled city now that should have that status? Which goes into the whole topic of Kedusha Rishona or Kedusha Rishniya we've discussed in the past, that when the Jews, the halach is the way the Rambam Paskins and many Rishonim Paskin, that the first time the Jewish people conquered the land, it was Kitchel Shaita. It didn't have permanent Kedusha. And when they left the land, in the Babylonian exile, the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael ceased to some extent. And then when they came back with Ezra in the Second Commonwealth, that extended the Kedusha for all eternity. Chazaka, Kibush, without getting into the whole, again, beyond the scope. But based on that, some commentators extrapolate that when we say Yehoshua ben Nun, we don't actually mean Yehoshua ben Nun. We could extend that to meaning any city that is walled today. And based on that, even though we obviously don't paskin that way, the Rambam and all the Rishonim don't paskin, but now it already starts making sense. Prague, the people of Prague, never thought that they may have been walled from the time of Yeshua ben Nun, but they were, as a custom, as a celebratory thing, they also celebrated the 15th in according with this opinion, which could lead us to the result that any city that currently has a wall should celebrate on the 15th. I have to do more research on this, but it's also possible to suggest something much more simplistic, although I don't know that it would apply to all of those cities, is that, but certainly for some of those cities, possibly Prague and others, that they may have been walled, or they may have been at least possibly, there could have been a legitimate suffix that they may have been walled not in the time of Yeshua ben Nun, but in the time of Achashverosh. And
my question is,
yeah,
for 2,000 years, now they know that Prague and this and that because we didn't listen, we didn't hear about it. So how come, all this come with different location, like the second Choma?
לא הבנתי.
אוקיי. אני שומע פה שזה אומר ככה וזה אומר שצריך לעשות זה, ויש להוא בפראג, יש לו שם איזה שזה פעם זה היה, פעם זה, איך כל הסיפורים, עכשיו אני שומע פעם ראשונה את הסיפורים האלה, שיש עוד חוצת בין יהושע בן נון בירושלים.
Oh, well, one second. Okay, let me finish your. אני חושב ש...
קלעת מה שאני אומר.
אני חושב. Okay, so where was I? Oh yeah, so it's possible that some of these cities started the minhag to do it on the 15th in accordance with the opinion that's explicitly recorded in the Tosefta, that we go by which cities were walled in the times of Achashverosh. In practice, virtually all of these cities no longer do 2 days of Purim. To the best of my knowledge, Prague does not do it anymore. Okay, some of these cities don't even have Jewish communities anymore. I don't know that there's any Jews in Damascus. But some of them, I seem to recall that in Istanbul, they still do 2 days of Purim, and right now, Lemaisa. Let's move back Okay, let's just summarize so far. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, there were many cities that did Purim at least also on the 15th, either just as a celebratory minhag, or they were actually doing a chumrah according to one opinion or the other. Nowadays, those cities are almost non-existent. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, not that the cities are non-existent, but the minhag of doing 2 days Purim in those cities are almost non-existent. And outside of Eretz Yisrael, virtually the entire Klal Yisrael celebrate Purim only on the 14th. Of course, there's also the celebration of the 15th. We don't say Tachnun. Some communities still wear Shabbos clothes on the 15th. Rachmana litzlan, if somebody's sitting Shiva, so most of the laws of Shiva are suspended, certainly for Ashkenazim, on the 14th and the 15th. But there's no Megillah reading, and most people are going back to work, etc.
Remember when I was young, before the sunset, we were going to Jerusalem to hear again.
Oh yeah, okay, very good. So
That's
right,
what we did.
but what about in Eretz Yisrael? So in Eretz Yisrael is basically so in Eretz Yisrael like this. The only city today, currently, the only city in the world that does Purim only on the 15th is Yerushalayim. That's the only city in the world that does Purim only on the 15th, and 14th is just a regular weekday. So they fast on Esther on the 13th, then 14th is a regular weekday. I mean, they don't say Tachnun, and but they don't sell. There's no Megillah, no celebrations, and then 15th is Purim. In theory, there could be many cities like that, but in practice, that's the only city that we have absolute knowledge that Yerushalayim is a city that is in the same place that it used to be, and it used to have a wall, and therefore, even though it doesn't have a wall now, it does Purim only on the 15th. Even that wasn't always the case. There certainly was a time when there was at least some people in Yerushalayim who used to do 2 days of Purim, but the Rabbanim that was abolished. Like the Rabbanim felt very strongly over the years that Yerushalayim should only be the 15th. That's recorded. There's a very important sefer called Kafte V'Ferach. Kafte V'Ferach was a 14th century rabbi by the name of Rabbi Shturi Aparchi. I believe Ashturi is not his real name. I think it's a pen name, but either way, that's how he's known, Rabbi Shturi Aparchi. And he was the first Jewish scholar who went back to Israel and traveled and studied very, very extensively to try and determine today you might call it archeology, but the sort of the history of geography of Israel, where the exact borders of Eretz Yisrael, which has tremendous halachic ramifications. This year is Shemitah, exactly if you're in the south, exactly where the southern border is still today a big controversy. So Rabbi Shturi Aparchi, so obviously subsequently there were many others, and some people agree with him and don't agree with him on certain things, but he is like, if anybody's touching this topic, like he is the most important sefer to learn. And he writes that he witnessed or he heard direct testimony that there were communities in Yerushalayim doing 2 days of Purim. Okay, that minhag has long been forgotten. Today, everyone in Yerushalayim does the 15th. The area.
Does it make a difference between whether they're inside the wall or not?
Oh, excellent question. Excellent question. So, obviously, Yerushalayim, you have the old city of Yerushalayim, and then you have all what's called Yerushalayim HaChadosh, the new city. But really, even within the new city, you could separate it into two distinct parts. You have that which is one continuum of houses and habituated areas that extends way beyond the area of the old city. And then you have surrounding neighborhoods, which are considered Yerushalayim, but they're separate mountains, and there's certainly gaps in between with no houses. Those just mentioned, Ramot, Ramat Shlomo, Neve Yaakov, etc., right? Now, so let's break this down. I mentioned before, there's the concept of Samuch V'Nira, which really means Samuch Oinira. That means if you have a place that is in close proximity, that is within how many mil? I think within 1 mil, within a certain distance from the city, from a walled city. So then that place also does Purim only on the 15th. right? So if you were to know, imagine a scenario: you have a city that's inhabited and has a wall around it from the time, or had a wall around it from the time of Yeshua ben Nun, and then there's another city
Suburb.
that's right next to it, and you could see it. So then they do Purim on the 15th. That's mefurish.
Suburb, right?
1 second. So how do we apply this to modern day Yerushalayim? By the way, there's another really important question here, because we mentioned before. Okay, we're learning this out prasi. So we're saying that just like we're applying many of the laws of the Torah that apply to selling a house in a walled city, we apply to Megillah. Now, if you look in the Torah where it talks about the city that has a wall, Asher loy chayma, that word loy, which it has a wall, which would be spelled lamed vav, is actually spelled lamed aleph, and it's one of those which means that it doesn't have a wall. And from there we derive, so it's one of those words that's spelled one way but pronounced, or in this case translated another way, but it kind of has this dual meaning, from which we learn out that even if it doesn't currently have a wall, if it used to have a wall, we go by Yeshua ben Nun. Okay, but that's only if the city still exists. If the city still exists, but the wall no longer exists. What if the city itself no longer exists, or if the city itself is no longer under Jewish rule? Now that became relevant to Yerushalayim until 67, when, or certainly until 50 in the 40s, yeah, when the entire no, even after no, even before 67, there were parts of the old city that were under Jewish rule, I believe. No, weren't there parts, or was it all under Jordanian wall and there were just Jews living there?
This whole business in, where they finally captured Jerusalem. The Eden captured Jerusalem, and then they had a treaty or something that gave it.
Right. Okay, I don't remember the exact history, but the Mefarshim talk about it, that during the times when Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, was under Jordanian rule, how do we apply that? Okay, just let's move to today, right? So today, Baruch Hashem, the old city of Jerusalem is occupied. And I don't mean that in the political sense. I just mean in practice, there are Jews living there, and under Jewish rule.
But the Temple Mount is under the administration of the Islamic Waqf.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. But the old city of Jerusalem is thing. Okay, so in practice, Yerushalayim, the entire area of Yerushalayim, that is one continuum of houses, they all do, in practice, not everybody, but 99.9% of Jews who live there do Purim only on the 15th. What about the further out, the outlying neighborhoods? So there may be some, again, I don't know, I'm not expert in all the different neighborhoods. There may be some who still do both, but more and more as there's more neighborhoods being built and the continuum of houses is becoming, the break in between the houses is becoming smaller, they're starting to do only the 15th. So for example, you mentioned Ramat. Ramat, some time ago, used to do Purim on the 14th, or they used to do 2 days or something like that. Once they built Ramat Shlomo, which is between Ramat and Yerushalayim, so now in Ramat, to the best of my knowledge, they only do the 15th because that extended the continuum of houses. And basically the argument is that even though the argument is that basically the Gemara talks about Samach V'nira, a city that's close. But here, because you have continuum of houses, and we recall the laws of Tchumen, for Shabbos, how we measure exactly cities, right? What time is it? Oh, wow.
11 minutes.
Right. So because of that, even though, so therefore the houses in Jerusalem that are part of the continuum of houses, even though they're way past the old city, they still do Purim only on the 15th because it's considered one city. And then that could then, you have to do the exact measurements to all these outlying neighborhoods, but it all extends to there. That is the practice. However, we have to mention that there was a very prominent Rav called Rabbi Tukushinsky, and he's very famous for a whole host of stuff. But in fact, if you go onto myzmanim.com, you will see there's one of the Zmanim, there's Tukushinsky's Zmanim, okay? But he's also famous for being one of the one of the primary and first of contemporary poskim who delved deeply into figuring out mitzvahs at Luis Baritz, figuring out, as it in the last century became more and more Jews coming back to live in Eretz Yisrael. So there were all these forgotten laws which had to be figured out exactly together with a modern application, the laws of Shemitah, Trumas, Meisers, and including in that is the laws of Purim on the 15th. Now, Rabbi Tukachinsky held very, very strongly that we have to treat Yerushalayim vis-a-vis keeping Purim on the 15th only Yerushalayim ha'atika, within the wall, and anything that is within the distance of Samuch v'nireh to the old city. So he didn't hold of this thing of the continuum of houses. He had that distance, and that was a hard line for him. And therefore he paskin, for those familiar with the geography of Yerushalayim a little bit, that basically past the bus station, past Rehov Yafo, anywhere from there, and I don't know which direction, whatever it's west, away from the old city, has to do Purim on the 14th. And every year he published a calendar with all his things, and he wrote, outside of here, you do Purim on the 14th. Until today, there is a minyan, there's a shul, actually not far from the bus station, I forget what it's called, maybe Eitz Chaim or something, where they are the followers of Rabbi Tukachinsky, already passed, certainly by the 60s, possibly even in the 50s, but they're still following his psak, and they do Purim on the 14th. So actually, I remember somebody was flying from England to Israel on Purim night, and she lived in Jerusalem. So she heard the Megillah by night in England, and then she took a late night flight to Israel, and she came. So instead of having to go somewhere else to hear the Megillah, because for her Purim was it's another whole topic, but because let's say at sunrise of Purim, she wasn't in Jerusalem, so she has to keep Purim on the 14th. And she then did on the 15th as well. But where are you going to hear the Megillah on the 14th? So she went to that shul to hear the Megillah. Actually in Rav Zevin's Sefer, Moedim B'Halacha, he writes very sharply. He says, I don't understand why Rabbi Tukachinsky keeps on doing this. He keeps on writing that you're supposed to keep Purim on the 14th, even though he knows nobody's listening to him and everybody only does Purim on the 15th. And why is he being so stubborn? And anyway, okay. All right. So that's as far as Yerushalayim goes. Now, here's where it gets really juicy, and we have limited time left. So what are we going to do with our limited time, guys? All right. I'm going to talk about Beit Shemesh. Now, Beit Shemesh, I'm using Beit Shemesh kind of as a guinea pig, but not as a guinea pig. It's just, we could virtually have the same discussion about numerous cities and places in Israel. The reason why I'm choosing Beit Shemesh is because that's the one that's been in the news very prominently this year and in recent years, because Beit Shemesh, Ramat Beit Shemesh specifically, there's a very strong controversy around Beit Shemesh, and basically the controversy is that we now have we know that Eretz Yisrael in the time of Yoshua ben Nun was absolutely full of walled cities. In fact, in Sefer Yehoshua, where it lists all the cities of the borders. So there's different opinions about this, but there's certainly, according to one interpretation from the Yerushalmi, it turns out that any city that is mentioned by name in the book of Yehoshua, we know for certain that was a walled city. Right? Okay, there are those who argue on that, but that is an opinion. So the land is full of walled cities, which actually makes for a whole host of cities that historically have been doing 2 days. So while we mentioned that Jerusalem is the only city that does 2 days, only the 15th, there are numerous cities in Eretz Yisrael that do 2 days. Tver, Tzfas, Chevron, many people in Haifa, many people in Lud. In fact, in Lud, some people want to argue to do only the 15th because they seem to have very strong archaeological evidence that they're close to the ancient city of Lud, and the ancient city of Lud is even more important to do the 15th than cities, because all the cities mentioned in Yeshua, there's only one opinion that they were walled cities, but Lud itself is explicit in the Mishnah in Erechin that it was a walled city. So if we are to determine that modern day Lud is basically at the same place where ancient Lud was, so then they should do on the 15th. And by the way, that's relevant to a lot of Lubavitchers, because Kfar Chabad is arguably Samuch V'nira to Lud. You could see Lud from Kfar Chabad. So the question is, why doesn't Kfar Chabad do 2 days? And as we'll see soon, that it seems, and I don't know why, that many Lubavitchers Lubavitcher poskim have a very, very strong aversion, and they want to do 14th and the 14th only, and that's it. It's interesting also that when it comes to 2 days Yom Tif, there's a strong argument to be made that many places in Eretz Yisrael, including Kfar Chabad, should be doing 2 days Yom Tif, because there are places that didn't used to have, that weren't inhabited in the time when they were being Kaddish Chodesh on Pierre. Again, I digress beyond the scope, but again, in practice, there's a strong aversion to that, and virtually nobody does that. What else? Yafo, right? Akko, Shechem, Yericho, Adar, Ramallah, Beit Shan. Many cities in Israel are doing 2 days and have been doing so for centuries. But the question becomes, as more and more archaeological work is being done and studied, and don't forget, the whole science of archaeology is a fairly modern, fairly recent science, right? Fairly recent. It's only the last, I don't know exactly, but decades, not centuries, that archaeology has become so advanced.
Probably more than 100 years, but
not much, right? And certainly, and certainly, it's made tremendous advances in the last centuries, in the last decades, right? So suddenly, we're finding remnants and identifying remnants of cities, remnants of walls of cities, and that we can identify as being certain cities in the book that are mentioned in the book of Yehoshua, in the Mishnah and Erech, that we know they were walled cities, and suddenly we have all these, so specifically, okay, so let's talk about Beit Shemesh, right? I can give you here a whole list of names of rabbis who say, yes, absolutely, Beit Shemesh have to do 2 days of Purim. And then there's a list of rabbis who say absolutely not, only the 14th. I have here a 6-page tshuva from the Chabad rabbi in Beit Shemesh, Rabbi Abishid, and he writes absolutely only the 14th. Personally, I mean, just again, we only have limited time to go through this, but I don't find him to be saying anything very convincing. I mean, thank God nobody's asking me, but if they were asking me, I would probably say they should do 2 days.
Again, without a bracha on the 15th.
And this it became even last year. It was very big in the news, but last year it wasn't as relevant because it was Purim Meshulish. So anyway, they were reading it was Friday, so anyway they were reading Megillah on the 14th. But this year, so there's very prominent poskim on both sides of the case. But this year, Moshe Brandstoffer, who's very famous because his father was famous, the Knei Boisam, he said they have to do 2 days, and then 2 days later, the Adar came out with a letter, a very strongly worded letter that you do Purim only on the 14th, and it didn't even say any reasoning. It did, I think, allude to the fact that they were going to publish a reasoning, but not yet, and they're probably going to wait till after Purim because they don't want anybody to undermine them. If you tell them a reason, you could argue with them. If they don't tell you a reason, you just got to listen, right? Okay, let's try and go through. Right. So let's try and go through the primary arguments. So first of all, there is one of the principles that we mentioned before, the Kafte V'Farach and Prauge Aparchi places, and he makes a strong argument with this, is that names of cities basically don't change. And therefore, we could trace where ancient cities are, even before archaeology. We could trace where ancient cities are based on names that have been kept by the Arabs. And there are dozens of cities where the Arabic names matches almost to an exact science, almost exactly, obviously with the change in accent, etc., to these names of cities that we know in Yehoshua. Coupled with that, the fact that the recent archaeological discoveries and findings and understandings, you could almost prove without a shadow of a doubt what these ruins are. And I'll pass this around soon. In fact, I could pass it around now. If you look here, look at this. You can literally see an ancient city with a wall. This is the ancient wall, and you're literally a stone's throw away. This is the edge of Ramat Daled in Beit Shemesh. Right? One of the reasons this came up more recently is because these buildings that you're looking at right here, Ramat Daled of Beit Shemesh, are very recent. It's in the last couple of years that this part of Beit Shemesh has been further expanded, so we're really, really close to this place called Tel Yarmut. Tel Yarmut is one of the cities in Yehoshua being a walled city. There's also another Tel Beit Shemesh. There's another side of Beit Shemesh that's near a different city, and in the laws of Tchumen, one of the areas of complication is exactly how you measure things. How you measure things, exactly what do you measure, to the building or to the sidewalk or to the street? Do you measure from this side of the wall, that side of the wall? Do you measure in a straight line, in the shortest line? Do you put the world on a straight northeast, southwest and measure that way? Do you round off? If you're talking about Tchumen, how you round things off. If you have a city that's not an exact square, which cities are, right? So then you sort of round things up. So a lot of it gets into those type of complicated halachas. Let's go through this very quickly. What are the arguments to keep Purim on the 15th in Beit Shemesh, or also on the 15th? Number one, we have a wall. We have a wall, even if you wouldn't know anything about the wall, the halacha in Shulchan Aruch is, you find an ancient wall, would be reason to do this. And then you have there's other cities over there that are that besides Tel Yarmut, etc. And of course, we have the names I've mentioned before. The Kafta Ferach says names is a very strong. The fact that the Arabs kept the names. Now, what are the arguments against that? By the way, I should mention there's a sefer here which this is just the link to it. You can download the PDF online. It's a sefer of over 300 pages, specifically about what day Purim should be in Beit Shemesh. Not only about Beit Shemesh. 300. Obviously, he goes through all the sunya. But if I'm not mistaken, he comes to the maskana that Beit Shemesh should be doing Purim only on the 15th. Not even 2 days, only on the 15th. Okay.
I was wondering why
Right. So what are I have to give a little bit lahazbir panim to the other side. What are the by the way, you should mention one of the names that comes up a lot in this discussion is, I don't know how to more than 1,000 years before the Gafta Ferach, and he
almost sounds like
no, but it's not, because he was and he already then went through the names of the cities and compared them to All right. So what are the arguments against doing the thing on 2 days of Purim in Beit Shemesh? So basically, we say like this. Okay, first of all, you said you found the wall, but you didn't really find the wall. You found some stones. Now, yes, it's true that those stones used to be a wall, but just the fact that you found stones doesn't mean that you're finding a wall, right? So yes, if you find a wall, then you have to keep Purim on the 15th. But if you find stones that used to be a wall, remnants of a destroyed wall, you don't keep it on the 15th. Also, those who are against it.
So you're saying, what's this argument that the stones may not have been a wall around the city?
No,
but they were. So there was a wall in the time of Yeshua ben Nun, and the wall was destroyed.
We're breaking this down. The first argument was, forget about history, forget about archaeology, forget about anything you know. The halacha in Shulchan Aruch is, you find a wall, so you have to assume, you find an old wall, you have to assume that it might have been there from Yeshua ben Nun, and you do 2 days. So these rabbis are saying that's if you find a wall, not if you find remnants of a wall. Now, what are you then going to say? Oh, but the remnants of a wall indicate all the archaeological stuff that we know what this used to be. Well, actually, you can't really rely on names of cities. Maybe the name he writes over here that you're telling me that because the Arabs called this city Harbat El Yarmukh, which is like Tel Yarmut, but actually it could be Yarmas, which is a different city, which is not okay. Fine. So they're trying to make the argument that the fact that we have names that tell us what these cities used to be ain't all that important. We don't like relying on archaeologists because they lie and they're not from, and they believe in evolution and they believe in all sorts of heretical things. So why are we taking them so seriously anyway? Hold on, I'm going to get there. Hold on. Okay. So there are some more arguments. Let me just address that my feeling is, my sort of reading between the lines over here, is that there's two very strong between the lines underlying currents over here as to why these Rabbanim are very resistant to embracing 2 days of Purim and Beit Shemesh. I think there's two reasons. One reason is being very conservative, lowercase c. We don't want to make changes. We want to uphold traditions. We don't like new stuff. New stuff, we're scared of new stuff, right? I'm not saying we, but some people are very scared of new stuff. Maybe I am too, I don't know. But so cities that have a tradition to keep 2 days, okay, fine. But to institute a new city for 2 days, we're going to push back, right? That's number one. And number two is really a sociological thing, which I just touched on now, is this sort of divide between, which is much more pronounced in Israel than it is here, between the observant and non-observant communities, between the heretical scientists who hate the Torah and hate Yiddishkeit and don't believe and therefore there's this sort of knee-jerk reaction to try to disprove and disbelieve anything the archaeologists say. The problem with that is that, like Rabbi Duke said, but besides that, it's becoming less and less possible to do so because, again, as the advances of archaeology become more and more, it's almost like just staring at you in the face, A. And B, today we have even very frum, pious, learned Jews who are very big historians and archaeologists. Most notably, there's a Rabbi Yehuda Landi who's written a big lecturer, written many columns and Sfarim in Hebrew, and even in English, he has a book called Purim and the Persian Empire. In English, we have it here in the library by Yehuda Landi, where he goes through it's fascinating book. Very strongly recommended read. But he goes through the history of Purim and Shushan and Ahasuerus, and it's unbelievable stuff. And you can't tell me that and actually over here, you'll see there's actually a meeting, pictures here of a meeting between a whole group of very prominent Haredi rabbis, together with a whole group of very non-Haredi archaeologists, right? And they've come to a place where they realize we've got to sit down and talk, right? So used to be walled, and it no longer has a wall, right? We do Purim on the 15th. Okay, so that would be, you have Tel Yarmut. Tel Yarmut used to have a wall. If you were to rebuild Tel Yarmut, so then you sort of revived the old Tel Yarmut. But here, nobody's rebuilding the old city. They're not even allowed to rebuild the old city. The authorities in Israel don't allow that, right? They're building a random city, Beit Shemesh, and it happens to be that as a fluke, right? They bumped into Tel Yarmut. So that's not called rebuilding an old city. That's a new city, and it doesn't relate to the old city. Okay, that's a svara. It's an argument. It's a logical argument. Whether or not it's hard to, I don't know that it's so easy to find proof to that argument, but it's an argument that's made. Really, a big part of this debate then surrounds around the following, and that is that the Mishnah Berurah and Bihar Halacha basically accepts two things. Number one, that if, and we alluded to this before when we spoke about Jerusalem being under Jordanian wall, that Jordanian rule, that if a city is destroyed, then the places that are some of the places, that if the city is destroyed, it no longer has that din, right? And therefore, even though you've rebuilt Beit Shemesh, if you were to, right, but it's kind of similar to the thing.
If basically you were to get 1 million of people right on the
Tel
place
Yarmut,
where inside the archaeological walls they found, and they were to read Megillah, they still would say they should only do it on the 14th. Is that what it is?
Yes, that's what the Masas Moshe would understand. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is quoting this from the Masas Moshe, who's quoting it from the Ran. The counter argument is that the Masas Moshe didn't see the Ran, And had he seen the Ran, he would have realized that all it was all because they didn't have Sfarim like we have today. And had he seen the Ran, he would have seen that actually the Ran is just quoting the Ramban. And had he seen the Ramban, he would have seen that that's not actually what the Ramban meant. And this is a common problem that we come into. Rabbi Katz from Buffalo Grove gave a class on that topic right here in this room a few months ago. Now, what do you do when you suddenly have revelations that you're like, hey, if the rabbi 500 years ago had access to the information that I have, maybe he would have said something different. So that's a big part of the discussion here. And another thing, which again kind of runs into similar topics, is that the Birkei Yosef, the Chida, writes that that any place that is any element of Safek, you don't apply that to Samach V'nira. So whereas Jerusalem, which is certainly on the 15th, so then any place that's in close proximity, Samach V'nira to Jerusalem, does it also on the 15th. But if you have Tel Yarmut, which is only a Safek, because even if you were to know 100% that it's for sure that it's Tel Yarmut, you still don't know 100% that it was walled from the time of Yeshua ben Nun. It's a Safek. Says the Chida that because it's a machlokes in Yerushalmi, right? And there's a wall, but you don't know for sure if the wall is that old. So maybe it's even older. Maybe it was destroyed before Yeshua came in, right? So says the Chida, quoted by the Bir Halacha, that no, we don't apply Samach V'nira to places that are a Safek. So even if you know for sure that that's Tal Yarmut, you still do Purim on the 14th. And again, the question is what image. The question is, do we accept this Birkei Yosef and this Chida or not? And part of the argument goes on over here is that there's the Mishnah Berurah and there's the Bir Halacha, and some say, well, the Bir Halacha is a phenomenal sefer, but some have some sort of tradition that the Bir Halacha can sometimes be more speculative than actual paskening halacha versus Mishnah Berurah, which is much more firm. And this is a conversation which we could talk for many hours. L'maisa, again, I think it's going to be split because, and there's more. In fact, there's another place called Tal Beit Shemesh, which they don't know for sure because they have limit. They can't dig under the buildings, but they want to say that actually there are parts of Beit Shemesh that are literally right on top of where the old walled city used to be in the times of Yeshua ben Nun. The bottom line is that, of course, this is an ongoing machlokes and probably going to be until Mashiach comes, until there's a unanimous vote. But what I think is it's important to remember, and this is where this thing becomes so fascinating, is that right now we're talking about Beit Shemesh, but you could pretty much have the same conversation about dozens of places in Eretz Yisrael, and it remains somewhat of a enigma as to why it is that so many places in Eretz Yisrael are not doing the 15th. And like I mentioned, I think there's a lot of pushback, specifically from Haredim and Hasidim. We have even adopting Tcheles, right? Which, in Chabad, there's a strong tradition, which is basically more mystical than halachic, about not wearing Tcheles in the times of Golus. But halachically speaking, it's really not, it's a very difficult argument to make to not wear Tcheles. And yet, many people are resistant to it. And other similar changes.
If we knew 100% for sure that is the Tcheles, we would still say don't wear it.
Chabad, yes, but I can't say I understand that. But that's what the Rabbi Rashab writes. Rabbi Rashab writes that beferish. But there are many others who don't have the tradition. Reb Chaim Kanievsky is quoted to have said that if you know for sure, if you think that you know for sure that this is the Tcheles, you're absolutely mechuyev to wear it. He doesn't wear it because he's not convinced. Now, I don't know what that means. Does that mean that he's actually gone through all the material and he's not convinced, or he just doesn't want to go through the material because he doesn't want? I don't know. I can't speak for him. But this remains a very alive, relevant, current topic for thousands of Jews in Eretz Yisrael every year as to when they should actually keep the mitzvah of Purim. This year, it's the city of Beit Shemesh that's in the headlines. Next year, maybe it will be Kfar Chabad.